we live in these two sort of sensory worlds. One that is our local sort of biological senses, the things that are in front of us that we can see, that we can feel, that we can taste, et cetera. But then this wider sensory world that we live in that connects us literally globally. You pick up your phone and you're connected globally. And those connections are just as physical as they are abstract, right? The infrastructure that we've put around the planet to connect us all. And there can be a really complex interaction between those two sort of sensory spheres that really mess us up, when it comes to trying to understand the impacts of our decisions on a global scale.
Welcome to Care More, Be Better, a podcast for people like you who care about the social impact of conscious companies and everyday heroes. Hear inspiring stories from those who put people and planet before profit and personal gain. You'll learn how you can make a difference, vote with your dollars, and get involved today. Here's your host, Corinna Bellizzi.
Welcome to Care More, Be Better, a podcast for people like you who care about the future of our planet and are ready to do something about it. Today's conversation is one I've been eagerly awaiting. I'm joined by evolutionary biologist, Princeton professor, and Emmy-nominated host of Human Footprint, Shane Campbell-Staton. Shane is a rare voice in science media, someone who doesn't just study how humans shape the natural world, but who explores how our culture, history, and even politics impact evolution itself. His work brings cutting-edge science to the public through powerful storytelling, something we desperately need more of today. This episode is also a celebration of season 2 of Human Footprint on PBS, airing Wednesdays starting June 25th. PBS remains one of the last truly nonpartisan public service media platforms, yet it's facing growing threats to its federal funding. So supporting programs like this matters more than ever. Shane's new season takes us from supermarket aisles in New York to beekeeping villages in Thailand, unraveling how humans are transforming ecosystems, species, and even the fate of life on Earth. And remember, this podcast is proudly climate positive. Through our partnership with forestplanet.org, we plant one tree for every new subscriber to our show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or on our website at caremorebebetter.com. Yes, that means we could plant 4 trees for every single one of you. So to date, we've already planted 17,615 trees toward our 2025 goal of 20,000. We are well on our way. So go ahead, click follow, plant a tree, and help regenerate this world we share. Let's dive into this powerful conversation with Dr. Shane Campbell-Staton. Wow, welcome to the show. I'm so glad to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
Now, I've been excited to speak with you, not just because of your work, Human Footprint, but because you bridge science and storytelling so beautifully. I'd love for you to talk about that.
Yeah, so for me, science and storytelling, they kind of go hand in hand. I think, especially for me, when, you talk to most biologists about like how they got into science, any scientist in general, how they got into science, what you will never hear is like, I just really love statistical significance. So ever since I was a kid, there's always a story, right? There's always a moment, in their lives that it captures them. Like it sparks some curiosity that then literally takes a hold of them and then drives them. For me, those moments came through television. So it's really interesting, and I feel very lucky now to be sort of on the flip side, to be able to tell stories about science, for a public audience. But they're really two sides of the same coin. Science is about stories. Evolution, many people have said this, but it's the greatest story ever told, right? It's the story that links everything, every organism that has ever existed together, back throughout the entire history of the planet. It's an incredible, incredible story. And as much as we like to think of ourselves as apart from that story, like separated from it, we are very much intertwined into it. We always have been, we always will be. And as modern humans, we're twisting and turning that story in a bunch of ways that, we never really expected.
So you said that you were introduced to nature in a way or this environmentalist perspective through television, which to me reminds me of my own childhood growing up watching something like that. Nature, or narrated by David Attenborough, some lioness killing a zebra or something to that effect. And as a parent now, I freely let my kids watch any nature programming that they want to, and it opens the door for having uncomfortable conversations about death, right? I feel like today we try to shelter our kids so much from these types of experiences that when they confront it later, they're less prepared. And I frankly like the idea of being able to talk to them about the cycle of life and food and the nature of beings, and how we have some animals that, eat vegetation and other animals that are obligate predators, right? And to introduce these types of language to my kids at an early age means that they have pretty broad vocabulary, which I think is also critical. And shows like yours do that too. So I'd love for you to talk a little bit about how you've built, let's say, the episode arcs that you create to help engage people and bring them into topics that they might not be familiar with.
Yeah. So, I think that television, it can be a bit reductive, and in general, I think our society has become somewhat reductive. We like to keep things simple, right? Keep it easy. But the biggest questions that we're dealing with now, they're not simple questions. They're not easy questions. They're not yes or no questions. They're very complex things. And the one thing that I've appreciated so much about PBS is that they've given us a platform to tell complex, complicated stories in a way that allows us to really dive into how deep and how broad those questions are in a way that I don't think we get to see much these days in television. In terms of how we build the story arcs for the show, I first and foremost have to give props to Neil Osen and Nate Dappin, the directors, Paige Buono, and rest of the producers for the series. There's a ton of writers, a ton of researchers that put different pieces together. But each episode, it starts as a journey, and it starts as asking a question that seems really simple at the face of it. Something that surrounds us every day that we may or may not even think about because it's so ubiquitous. But then when you start thinking about it deeper and deeper, the more convoluted and weird and strange it gets, and you realize how intertwined our personal decisions, our culture, our history, our politics are in the natural world, and how we change the natural world, but then also how those changes kind of turn around and then flip back and change our history, our politics, our culture in so many different ways. So each episode is 5 acts. And those acts each act takes us to a different place. I interview different people, and those acts combine to really, take what seems like something very simple in the beginning and really blows it up into the global phenomenon that it actually is.
This is the perfect spot to introduce people to the show. So I'm now going to play the introduction to your season 2 for Human Footprint.
It's about to go down.
We're just surrounded by weirdness and absurdity all the time.
It transforms everything.
I think I just fell in love.
I'm turning dreams into reality.
What did we do? How did we get here?
So this new season looks incredible, from global food chains to fashion to plight of pollinators, which is of course critical to our time with massive colony collapse all over the globe. What central message do you hope that viewers walk away with from each episode and from the season as a whole?
From the season as a whole, I hope that people walk away with an understanding that our decisions matter. And I think that's something that can be increasingly hard to understand sometimes, especially the way, things in current society can be. It's hard to feel like we have any sort of power, but if these episodes have taught me anything, like for having going on each one of these journeys, it's that, each of us can do something, and that there are solutions, so for me, the big thing, when we tackle the big questions of life, it's like, be it the hunger crisis, climate change, like all these big questions, they can seem so completely overwhelming. And it would be one thing if there just weren't any answers, right? Like that's a situation that's really hard to be in. But many times at the end of the day, you realize that, well, there are answers. And sometimes they're actually pretty clear and kind of simple answers. The question is, will we make the changes that need to be made in order to get to those answers? And as frustrating as that is as a position to be in, it's also something that gives me a lot of hope, right? Because, at least there's something that we can move towards, right, to make things better, right? And we can see it and it's there. And I think for me, I hope that's what people take from each of these episodes for each of these different topics, and also from the season as a whole.
Great. Now let's talk about a few examples. In shelf life, I'd love for you to share perhaps what surprised you most about how the supermarket changed us biologically and culturally.
The idea of the supermarket seems so normal, right? It's like every weekend, you go out and you make the supermarket run, buy your groceries, and, you have your food for the week. Everyone's been to a grocery store. It's like such a ubiquitous part of everyday life. You walk into the grocery store and there's nothing, it doesn't seem to be anything strange about it, but it's one of the weirdest places on the planet. You walk into this place where there are thousands upon thousands of choices. There are fresh fruits and vegetables that don't even grow that time of year that you're there picking, like that you're there getting them. And they may be grown on the complete opposite side of the world, but you get them and they're fresh and you can eat them. And we have had to change the entire world in order to make that happen. We've had to put together an entire global food chain, an artificial food chain in order to make that happen. And the degree to which it's changed the planet is absolutely astounding. And the history of it is astounding and disturbing a lot of the times as well.
Well, coming from the food industry, I could not agree with you more. I mean, frankly, we used to have a more market perspective where you would, do your local shopping, get your bread each day, what fruit was in season, and you would actually eat more types of food over the course of the year than most Americans do. I mean, most people here might consume a total of 10 vegetables in a given month. Mm-hmm. And that's quite different than how our ancestors were certainly going about things back in the day.
Absolutely.
Now, I'd love to talk a bit about the honey trap, because as you know, I introduced that in a bit of our introduction here. The importance of pollinators can't be understated. So bees do so much more than provide us with sweet honey and nectar. So what's the real story behind their collapse?
So there are a few different things that are going on. Typically, when people think about bees, they think about the honeybee. That's a sort of ubiquitous bee that is always on everybody's mind. But there are thousands of species of bees that are very, very different than the honeybee. And many of those bees are like solitary bees. Many of those bees, they live a very different kind of life, but they're crucial as pollinators. I mean, in terms of, when you think about ecosystems and like the value of ecosystems, some people like to put that in terms of like money. Like, how much is an ecosystem worth? Like pollinators, if we didn't have pollinators, most of the food that we know and love would not exist. It would be essentially corn and like Twinkies and, not much else besides that, because even the food that we feed, food animals has to be pollinated for the most part. these pollinators are on a really steep decline, but we've had this really close relationship with them for our entire history as a species. But even in terms of our relationship with the honeybee, like we started cultivating honeybees like 4,000 years ago. It's a very old relationship, and we depend on them for so much. And we know we depend on them for so much, yet they are under attack because of our current systems. The thing about humans is we never do anything just a little bit. We don't know how to, right? So if we're going to do anything, we have to do it huge, right? So when it comes to food, that means these like massive swaths of land, that we're using to plant one thing typically at a time. And then we protect it with pesticides and, all of these things. It's like a triple threat for any pollinator because these are insects as well, as much as like the things that eat those crops, they can be vulnerable to pesticides. So can the things that pollinate those crops, right? So they're facing this challenge of pollution, but then they're also facing these other diseases, colony collapse disorder, which we're still trying to understand. These things like varroa mites, which is a mite that was introduced into Florida, I think somewhere around 50 years ago, that has led to one of the biggest collapses of honeybee colonies that we've seen maybe in history. And that happened just a few years ago. So there are a lot of different things that are facing that pollinators have to face in order to survive and function and reproduce. And a lot of those necessities we're taking up, because we want to grow food, even while knowing that we need them in order to pollinate that food.
There's one last episode I want to touch on before we move into our next stage of the interview, and that's damned if you do. Water is life, but it's also control. And we've looked to water to provide green energy. I would love to know what your thoughts are around hydroelectric power and what you learned by traveling the Colorado River.
So one of the things, when you consider a river, it's a force of nature, right? In the most literal, raw sense of the word, it's a force of nature. And it forms the basis of so many different kinds of ecosystems in so many different ways. And for us as a species, we've taken that force of nature and we've harnessed it, we've domesticated it, we've turned it into something fundamentally different than it used to be, especially when it comes to the Colorado River. And we've done so for our own means. The Colorado River, there's so many people that are dependent upon the Colorado River, not just for water, but also for power. And the politics around who gets how much water, who gets how much power, etc. The decisions that are made are not always decisions that are based in reality. A lot of times they're based on, numbers that were from one specific year that was ridiculously wet for whatever reason. And instead of taking whatever percentage of water is available, divvying that up, there's a number that's put on. You get so and so many gallons of water. But by all estimates, the Colorado River it's shrinking. There isn't enough water to meet that demand. And we know this, but the policies haven't changed. And as much as, people have been lobbying for the policies to change, I think it's going to be a very, very hard sell, in order to actually get those policies to change. But what does that mean for the river itself? It means that it's become something fundamentally different than it ever was in its entire history. Like that river that carved the Grand Canyon, right? That river's gone. What we have now is something completely different. I started that journey at the head of the Colorado River and, looking at these massive dams, that are built. I mean, structures that are just some of the most incredible structures I've ever seen in my entire life. Like truly they speak to the ingenuity of who we are as a species, and there's something to be proud of there. But also as you start to move down the river, you realize like what those downstream, literally those downstream consequences are for taking something that is supposed to flow freely and latching it to a dam and using it for your own purposes, to the point where, I walked at the end of this journey, I think I walked maybe 3 miles through what was supposed to be riverbed, like out in, like moving towards the Gulf, that was completely dry and cracked and nothing, like literally nothing. I think you can even see like there are, like a whale skeleton like sticking out through the mud. Yeah, and what was supposed to be there, what you think of as a river, it's the farthest thing from it. Not because of anything natural, but because we're now using it for our own purposes. Yeah, and it says a lot about, who's made those decisions, why those decisions were made, who gets what from those decisions, and the people that get left out of those decisions. One of the very first things that I learned on that process is that, water is the contracts that we make around water, right? They can teach us a lot about what a society values, and who a society values. And that whole episode is about this journey of learning the cost of harnessing something as fundamental as water. And I think it's especially, to me, it hit most, when you realize, especially here in the States, right, you get life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are like the 3 sort of foundations, right? How much closer to life can you get than water, right? Water is life, very literally. So when you take something that fundamental and then there are haves and have-nots, it makes you think a lot about what those foundational principles are and what they mean, when it comes to our decision-making process as a population.
I want to recommend that people interested in this topic also revisit my episode interview with Steve Hawley, who wrote Cracked, which is specifically about the crumbling infrastructure of dams, specifically in the Pacific Northwest, but it applies elsewhere as well. And if you look at places like the Colorado River, what many people don't understand is that water supplies much of Southern California. Just as a for example, it supplies a lot of our farmland in California. California grows more produce than any other state in our union. So, the fruit and the vegetables that you eat that are grown in the United States often come from this state. So water rights are in part really tied to that because we need our food supply. So these stories are definitely connected. I even see that through line from your mention of grocery stores earlier to, the food we grow. Like these are connected ideas. Wow.
Yeah. And one of the things that I've learned on, by going on each of these journeys is this sort of fundamental interconnectedness of pretty much everything, and in so many different surprising ways. Like you would make connections that you wouldn't really think about under normal circumstances. So when you think about, this relationship between food and water and dams, once it's said out loud, it's like, oh, that makes sense. But how many people go to the grocery store and they're trying to choose between asparagus and romaine lettuce and are thinking about the Colorado River, or are thinking about water rights, and typically in a place that's very far removed. It's like I'm here in Princeton, New Jersey, thinking about the Colorado River, which is so far away. And one of the things I keep learning over and over again in so many different ways is that, we live in these 2 sort of sensory worlds. One that is our local sort of biological senses, the things that are in front of us that we can see, that we can feel, that we can taste, et cetera. But then this wider sensory world that we live in that connects us literally globally. You pick up your phone and you're connected globally. And those connections are just as physical as they are abstract, right? The infrastructure that we've put around the planet to connect us all. And there can be a really complex interaction between those two sort of sensory spheres that really mess us up, when it comes to trying to understand the impacts of our decisions on a global scale.
In this next section of our interview, I really want to talk about the connection between human evolution and the Anthropocene. You study how human activities, our culture, our politics, even technology, are now evolutionary forces. What are some of the species that have adapted in surprising ways to this human footprint?
Yeah, so my lab studies this in a very broad context. So we study a lot of different organisms in many different places. So you can think of, for instance, cities. Cities are the fastest growing ecosystems on the planet. We've just crossed the point where half of the human population, half of our species lives in cities. In the next 50 years, it's probably going to be 2/3 of humans will live in major metropolitan areas, these like urbanized environments. And in order to live alongside us, other organisms have had to find really interesting, sometimes weird and extreme ways, to occupy this ecosystem that's so fundamentally different in so many ways than any other ecosystem in evolutionary history, right? Like the structures are different, the dangers are different, the air quality, the noise environment, they're all so different. And so we've been studying adaptation to urban environments. In our case, we've been studying the small lizards called anoles that occur on the island of Puerto Rico. And this one species, the Puerto Rican crested anole, has moved into cities independently from different forest areas across the island. And they've adapted in very similar ways over and over and over again independently. These urban environments, these lizards are using like the sides of buildings and things like concrete and metal as perches instead of things like trees or leaf or scrub, whatever they may use in a natural quote unquote environment. And they've evolved longer limbs in doing this over and over and over again. And this is something that, we see, persists even when you bring them into the lab and they're born in the lab, they still grow longer limbs. So it seems to have a very strong genetic component to it. Urban environments are also much hotter, right? Because of all the reflective material and absorbent materials. Heat bounces around. It's what we call urban heat island effect. And urban lizards are much more thermal tolerant than lizards that live in forest areas. They can take a lot more heat and are able to function at higher temperatures. And that's just one aspect of our human footprint. So we've also studied the evolution of tusklessness in elephants in response to poaching, the evolution of alligators in the South in response to endocrine disrupting compounds in water sources. One of my postdocs is studying the evolution of wolves in Chernobyl in response to ionizing radiation. Each of these stories is about our human footprint. It's about the fundamental interconnectedness of us with the rest of the tree of life.
Well, I love that answer. You've touched on a couple of the unintended consequences that I think are key, one of which is just the heat pollution we create, because it is in a way pollution. I visit Arizona fairly routinely on business or conferences or whatever, even just to do field work. And, I recall days where Phoenix and Scottsdale area had far less pavement just in general. And they used to cool off a lot at night. And they don't so much anymore unless you're in the foothills where you are in true desert land, in part because that blacktop just stays hot a lot longer. It doesn't cool off the same way as real Earth does. And I think we need to all remember that as we think about things like building new cities. How are we going to build them differently? How can we introduce more of a permeable layer so that, there is breaks, or there are more breaks in when we have to pave something over, to ensure that natural ecology can respond the way it's meant to, in a way. Something I think a lot about, and I know that we are now working towards building greener cities where we have more plant life that can truly kind of restore that environment and absorb some of the carbon, and really work to build cooler cities that don't get so absolutely hot.
Yeah, I recently sort of gave a talk on this subject and did some back of the envelope calculations, thinking about what should the city of the future look like? And when I say the city of the future, I don't just mean cities that will be built in the future, but even cities that exist now. Right? And if we took, so in season 1 of Human Footprint, we went to Singapore to look at how they approach cities. And one of the things that they have implemented is that if you're going to build something, for every square foot of green space that you take away in order to build that structure, you have to put back in. Somewhere in that structure, you have to build it, into that structure. And so thinking about that just as a basic concept, and thinking about, high rises, like anything higher than 3 stories, if you make it, a vertical garden, if you did that in the largest 10 cities on the planet, you would have a green area that's like 3 times the size of Ireland, that's not insignificant. It's only like 0.4% of the Amazon rainforest, but that's still a lot of greenery, and the thing that I think about most now is building cities for the future. It's like, what if we built cities that animals did not have to adapt to? Right? Built cities, that they were already pre-adapted to, because they're actually so similar to the natural.
There's some habitat, the birds, the insects, things like this. Yes,
exactly. And we know that it can happen. I mean, in Singapore, there is just as much, if not more, biodiversity in the city proper as there is in the national parks. Now, obviously, Singapore is a very specific example. They have a very specific government structure and history, et cetera. But I think there's something that everyone can take from those examples.
Yeah, I 100% agree. Now, you've also said, this gets to more of the storytelling and social justice perspective now. You've said that science should be accessible and deeply human. What does that look like to you in practice?
So this is something that I've had to learn along the way as a science communicator, in that, as trained as an academic, as a researcher, as a professor, I'm used to telling people what I know, right? And that's fine. That's great. And in some cases that is necessary, but very few people want to be lectured to. I can tell you, even as a professor, even in the classroom, very few people want to be lectured to, but everybody wants to have a conversation, and one of the things that I've learned is that in order to be a successful science communicator, you have to give more of yourself than just what you know, right? It's like you become a conduit for the information, right? You as a human, right? It's easy to put off a fact or forget a fact. It's easy to, to brush away information. It's much harder to brush off people, and one of the things that I love about Human Footprint is how many different people I've gotten to interact with, coming from different walks of life, that have taught me so much about the thing that I thought I was the expert in, going into, something like invasive species, which we did in season 1. It's one thing to think about invasive species as a biologist. It's like, species, they get introduced from elsewhere, they adapt to these novel conditions, but they have a foot up because they don't have the constraints of the ecosystem, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But an invasive species means something much different after you go to a quote unquote redneck fishing competition and you in central Illinois, and you spend the day with a 3rd generation fisherman who now can barely make a living because the river is full of Asian carp, that have, been introduced from elsewhere and now make up the vast majority of the biomass of this river. It's one thing to think about cotton and domestication, from a biological standpoint, but it means something different after you've talked with, fifth generation Black cotton farmer in North Carolina who can step out of his house and look at the old plantation where his family was enslaved and still chooses, to plant cotton, because he's proud of it. It means something totally different. And it's these individual stories that really give the perspective, really give weight to the scientific understanding. And I found that even as a scientist, like I know what I do so much better now for having gone on all of these journeys and talked with so many people. I understand the context of the science that I'm trying to do now in a deeper and broader way than I would have ever been able to do without being a science communicator, without human footprint and the support of PBS.
Because you've essentially developed ethnographies. Like that's what this effort is. You're going deep into each of these topics with people that are directly affected. And I think that's what makes it so different. Now, so many science documentaries still center a white, male, Eurocentric lens. You've already answered this in part, I think, but I'd love for you to talk more about how Human Footprint aims to shift that for next.
Yeah, so Human Footprint is different in a few different ways. For me, doing a Human Footprint is the first thing I've ever hosted. I had this idea of doing this show about the Anthropocene and evolution in the Anthropocene, how our actions impact the world around us. And I talked with the directors, Neil and Nate. We had done some work previously, and they actually had a really similar idea, that they wanted to pitch as a nature documentary initially. And, I was like, well, I think it should be something hosted. And they were like, well, that's bold, given that I'd never hosted anything before. But they really got on board and they bought into it and bought into me, right? In terms of, my background, my culture, my insights, where I come from and what I'm about. So much of that is given to the show, for instance, the soundtrack is driven by R&B and hip hop and blues. The original score is done by Adrian Young, who's a hip hop legend. A lot of the sort of cinematography was inspired by like 90s music videos, for instance. It's something that I can truly say no one's ever seen before in a science or nature show.
Now, I wonder how you feel hosting is different from teaching, and what has taught you? What has hosting taught you? Hosting
has made me a better teacher as well. I think the thing that's most different about hosting is that most of the time on Human Footprint, as much as I have an expertise, I'm not the expert. I am actually a proxy for the audience. I can give my own insights, and you see them, sort of scattered, throughout each of the episodes. But every person I talk to, it's their expertise that I'm learning from. And as a proxy for the audience, is like, I'm literally inviting you to go on this journey with me, this person who thought I knew so much, in the beginning, and then just constantly gets humbled, throughout the entire experience, because, I realized that what I thought I knew was just a tiny, tiny piece of the whole. The other thing that hosting has taught me is that I have an opportunity, and this is one of the things that's really important to me as a scientist, is like I have the opportunity to not just share my own work, but to share my colleagues and their brilliance and their work and their passions with the wider world. And that's something that I'm so incredibly grateful for, like far beyond like me being on the screen myself. The fact that, I can sit down and literally be a bridge between science and society, is something that's really, really special for me, because, a lot of my colleagues, they're not going to have a chance to do this sort of a thing, host this kind of a show. And most of them probably wouldn't want to, honestly, because, it can be very uncomfortable sometimes. And it's a very odd thing to do in many ways. But what I can do is offer them an opportunity to share their work while talking to another scientist, another practicing scientist, but have a real conversation that we could have literally anywhere. We could be sitting on a park bench, we could be at a bar, and turn to the person next to us, whoever they are, whatever they do, wherever they're coming from, and invite them to be a part of a conversation. And that invitation is something that I think is probably the most important thing when it comes to science communication. Inviting people to conversation, even if they don't agree. There were some things in the first season where I got a lot of angry emails about. I was like, good. If you're passionate enough, and you're engaged enough in the subject matter to yell at me for 12 pages, at least you're engaged.
You inspired them to respond.
Exactly.
Yes.
Because the biggest. Sorry, give me 1 second. Yes, the biggest enemy to progress, right, isn't disagreement. The biggest the biggest enemy to progress is indifference, just not caring enough, but as long as people are invested, there's always room for a conversation, right? A conversation can be had. And if there's anything we need right now, it's conversation.
More discourse. Now, it sounds like you've fallen in love with hosting. I wouldn't be surprised if you end up with your own podcast down the road.
So I do have my own podcast, actually.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let's talk about that for a moment.
Yeah, so it's called the Biology of Superheroes podcast. It was actually one of the very first pieces of science communication I ever undertook. And so we made like 16 episodes over the course of a couple of years, and now through NSF funding, we're at the end of producing another set of 12 episodes that will be released sometime, hopefully by the end of the year.
Great. I'll be sure to share a link to that podcast with show notes. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, of course.
Now, at Care More Be Better, we talk a lot about concepts like regeneration, not just ecologically, but socially and economically too. How do you think that we can evolve from domination to reciprocity in our relationship with the planet?
That is a very difficult question.
Yeah, it is. It's one I work to answer every day too. So any insights you have?
Yeah. I think a big part of that has to do with connection, right? So, it's one thing to see, a cheetah running down a gazelle on television, in some far off place, but to realize that those fundamental things, right, the ecosystems that, dominate this planet, they're all around us, right? Life is all around us, and it shares that story with us, that one story of evolution. That interconnectedness, I think, is the thing that we're missing, because we get so caught up in our own thing. We get so caught up in our own problems, our own stresses, and those things are real. But I think in order for us to move past domination, and to rediscover some sort of an equilibrium, we have to reconnect in some way. And, that doesn't necessarily mean you have to go kayaking or go hiking and get lost in the woods, but even a walk in the park, like a breath of fresh air, like those little things can be very, very important and are very important to so many different people, but the idea that something has value beyond us, something has value beyond like what we can get from it, it's that thing that I think we need to move beyond, but at the same time, like those immediate problems, they can get in the way of it. One of the things that when I was in Mozambique in the first season, I sat down and talked with a park ranger, and he was like, conservation can only exist when people are being taken care of. When people aren't being taken care of, you can hang everything else up, because you can talk all you want to about the majesty of this animal or that animal, but if someone has to worry about what they're going to feed their children at the next meal, there's a luxury to thinking about the grandeur of nature that they just don't have. And so when I say that fundamental interconnectedness, I mean, if we treat each other better, if we can give each other the basics, right, that we need to survive, then we get freed up to then solve these greater problems. And they're one and the same, right? A conservation problem is a human problem as much as it is a biological problem, and, a political problem, a cultural problem, as much as it has anything to do with quote unquote, nature. So a holistic answer, is the answer.
Yeah. If somebody is worried about the food that they're going to put on their plate to feed their kids, they might sell that plot of land that they have and divest it to buildings as opposed to the forest that it is today. And that's happened. That does happen, We also see the same with regard to pollution, and people, if they can't afford garbage pickup and a service that is paid that isn't provided, then they tend to litter, yes, or stop off somewhere and throw their washing machine down into a river. And this does happen. It happens here in the United States. It happens in what we've considered the developing world or the third world, because people are struggling and they make choices that may not be ideal for our environment because they're in that struggle and that's their reality.
Yeah.
So I completely.
And to sort of bring that back around to, thinking about food, and, some of the things that we explore in that episode of Human Footprint, we can be a conundrum as a species. And the idea that we can both be dealing with a global hunger crisis and an obesity crisis at the same time is very strange. Mm-hmm. The solving global hunger, like how long has that been in the top 5 of like the biggest problems that we've had to face as a species and a growing population? But then again, it'd be one thing if there wasn't an answer, right? And a lot of times it gets presented as though how could we possibly solve something so large, right? And throughout this episode, we learn like how much gets invested in this global infrastructure, right? The cold chain, how much, gets invested in like the marketing. We were talking about billions upon billions upon billions of dollars each year, something that we find so fundamental and so valuable, yet in the US alone, 30 to 40% of that food ends up in the garbage before anybody eats it. And it doesn't take, a math genius to figure out, it's like, well, maybe the first step in solving global hunger is not throwing out 30 to 40% of the food that is grown and that is there and is available at one point. The solution, at least part of the solution, is right there in front of us. Mm-hmm. And the issue isn't finding the solution, it's making the decision to move towards the solution, which is simultaneously incredibly frustrating, but also is the thing that still gives me hope. Yeah.
So speaking to hope, what really inspires you to remain hopeful in times like this, when we can feel like there are a barrage of negative news stories coming our way, loosening restrictions from the Environmental Protection Agency, or, the many threats to our environment? What gives you hope? What helps you stay on that hope train, so to speak?
So I'll be honest. I mean, sometimes it's very difficult, and sometimes I do, tumble down the rabbit hole. But ultimately, like at the end of the day, I have to have faith in humanity. Right? I have to have faith in the human conscience, like our collective. Like nobody wants to be the bad guy in their own story. Nobody, right? And I don't think anyone sees themselves as a bad guy, in their own story. And yeah, there are always going to be differences in opinion, differences in approach, differences in, in what different people value. But I feel like I have to believe that over a long enough period of time, humanity is going to bend its decisions in the right direction, right? The arc of humanity, the arc of morality is going to bend towards the greater good. And we've seen many, if we look at the course of human history, we've seen many a travesty, like incredibly bleak times. But we've always come out on the other end and we've continued to progress. That's the thing that we do, right? If our history teaches us anything, is that, we can make huge mistakes, we can do some really awful things, but we also have the capacity to do incredible good, and as much as that Jekyll and Hyde equation is it's like always constantly moving back and forth, I have to think that in the end, the arc will bend towards good.
Aptly said. Thank you so much. Now, how can people get involved, whether it's watching Human Footprint, supporting biodiversity, or bringing science into everyday conversation? I'd love to know your thoughts.
How can people get involved? Well, I would say definitely watch Human Footprint. It's a step in the right direction. But I think in general, there are many ways for you to get in touch with the space around you. Whether and it doesn't have to be a big leap. You don't have to, rewire your entire life in order to make this happen. Little changes, can make a huge difference, right? So whether that's, having a garden outside, or whether it's, deciding to take a walk, in your neighborhood, for 10 minutes a day, just getting connected to the space around you, that in and of itself, I think, is a step in the right direction. I think we can live very individualistic lives, and those individualistic lives can disconnect us from, that thing that drives us to make decisions for the greater whole. So reconnecting in any small way, a community park, connecting with your local politicians, just connecting, generally speaking, can be a very, very powerful thing.
Well, thank you so much for joining me today. This has been an absolute pleasure. I could keep talking to you for days. Now, I am, of course, going to direct people to Human Footprint, airing on PBS starting June 25th. It's also streaming, so people can go online right now and review past episodes from season 1, enjoy all of that, and get caught up just in time for this new season. I'll also encourage people to follow your Instagram and LinkedIn, which I'm putting in show notes, and the Biologies of Superheroes podcast, which has about 30 episodes out between 2019 and 2020, with the new season soon to launch. Yes. So that's all fantastic. Is there any other site you'd like to direct them to?
I would say, in order to keep up with the research that's happening, in my lab here at Princeton, go to Campbell-Staton.com.
Awesome. I'll again be sure to include that with show notes. Thank you so much for joining me today. I truly appreciate what you're doing. And I have to say, this show, just like the one that you're hosting, is an invitation to care more so we can be better. And I love that about the Human Footprint. I've enjoyed reviewing episodes and previewing some of this season too. I wholeheartedly suggest people connect with it. And if they have the means, to also donate some funds to PBS. We know that their funding is presently under threat, and we want to be sure great programming like this is able to sustain the generations. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a true pleasure.
What a journey, from the ripple effects of our choices to the evolutionary consequences of supermarkets. Shane Campbell-Staton, brings a bold and deeply human lens to science, one that encourages us not just to ask how we live, but what kind of species we want to be. If you're as inspired as I am, make sure to tune in to season 2 of Human Footprint on PBS and go back and look at season 1 as well. This is storytelling with heart, intellect, and integrity, the kind of public programming that we must fight to protect as federal funding for PBS is threatened. And ultimately, we want to preserve these sorts of assets for all people. Support it, share it, and bring others along for the journey. And if you haven't already, follow this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, and on caremorebebetter.com. For every new follower, we plant a tree through our partnership with forestplanet.org. I understand Hank is on the ground in Tanzania right now, looking at the restoration effects and efforts that he has in place, restoring mangrove forests. We're now at 17,615 trees and counting, chasing our goal of 20,000 by year's end. I think we'll scream past it this summer. That's real impact, and it's powered by you and this show. Until next time, remember this. We can all take steps to regenerate this world that we call home. We can care more, we can be better, and together we can shape a future where all life thrives. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Care More, Be Better, a podcast for social good. To make sure you never miss an episode, subscribe, rate, and review wherever you listen to podcasts, and share with your friends to help us reach more people and spread more social good.